territory of the Algonquin Nation. As such, Carleton recognizes it has a responsibility to the Algonquin people and a responsibility to adhere to Algonquin cultural protocols. Since launching in 2019, Healthy Cities has been a vibrant series. And I want to acknowledge my wonderful colleague, Ann Bowker, who started the Healthy Cities series. And the Healthy Cities lecture series and discussion series has been developed first by Ann to explore the many factors that form a thriving and equitable city for the people who inhabit it. Previous Healthy Cities events have examined various topics such as anti-racism, climate change, architecture, aging, housing. And we have more great conversations to come. In fact, we have a second Healthy Cities coming up in the spring, in March 2023, on disability justice in the city, led by our colleague Kelly Fritsch. Today, our impressive and diverse expert panel will discuss the distinct and precarious scenario that so many of us are facing this fall. That is the return to school after extended closures, delays, and disruptions due to global pandemic, disruptions that continue to challenge all of us as a community. We are undoubtedly in for a timely and riveting conversation tonight, and I'd like to offer my sincerest thanks to our remarkable panelists, but also to all of you who've joined us in person. We appreciate your presence here very much. This will also be taped, so it can be available for those unable to attend. And I have my pleasure now to introduce the moderator for tonight, Dr. Julie Garlen. Dr. Garlen is a childhood and youth studies professor at Carleton and director of the Institute for Interdisciplinary Studies. And I'll turn it over to you, Julie.
Thank you, Carol. And thanks again, everyone, for being here tonight. We appreciate you coming out for this very first event back in person after a really long time. So you'll have to bear with us, as I think all of us have kind of lost our ability to, speak in person to some extent. So we're all probably a bit nervous in terms of just, being here in person and being put on the spot in ways that, challenges us in ways that maybe Zoom doesn't. So it's a good challenge for us and a nice transition. So as Carol mentioned, my name is Julie Garlen. I'm a professor of childhood and youth studies at Carleton. And I'm also the director of the Institute of Interdisciplinary Studies, where Leila is one of my colleagues. And back in the summertime, Carol contacted me, and she had been thinking, I'd also been thinking for a while that I would really like to include childhood and youth studies in some of the Healthy Cities panel series. And so her call came at a great time when I was kind of thinking about some of the programming that we might do for this year. And we did a bit of brainstorming, and we were thinking about, what could we do? There's a lot to do around, children's experiences, a lot that has to do with youth experiences. And we were both thinking a lot about this moment of returning to school and back to school. And my own background is from teacher education, at least in my practice. My research is more cultural studies of childhood, critical theory, education, curriculum studies, and so I do much more cultural theoretical work around thinking about childhood and education. But my professional work has all been as an elementary school teacher and also as a teacher educator, so working in schools alongside student teachers and practicum students for many years before I moved to Canada in 2018. So my mind immediately went to the challenges that we're facing in terms of returning back to normal, so to speak, after this long period of many interruptions and many challenges that we faced. And so I was able to reach out to these wonderful panelists here that I'll introduce briefly, and I'll also allow them to tell you a little bit more about their own perspectives and their own work as we have a sort of a roundtable discussion tonight. I have some questions prepared to kind of prompt them in thinking about some of the issues around back to school here in Ottawa and Ontario and across Canada more broadly. And we'll invite them to respond to that as they wish. So we won't keep an order. It'll kind of be, whoever feels drawn to respond. And then after we have our roundtable discussion, we'll open up the discussion to the audience. So if you have questions, we'll invite you to ask the panelists your questions as well. So I'll just introduce our panelists tonight, who all bring very different perspectives to thinking about this issue of getting back to school in the city. We have first, on my left here, we have Dr. Leila Angod. And Leila is an assistant professor of childhood and youth studies at Carleton. Leila's critical race feminist research reveals the role of schooling discourses, policies, and practices in making racial regimes. Her scholarship intervenes in the normalization of institutional violence at schools and mobilizes youth co-led research to create critical communities of care. Leila's scholarship draws from her experience as a secondary school teacher in southwestern Ontario. We also have next Dr. Maria Rogers. And Dr. Maria Rogers is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Carleton University and a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Child and Youth Mental Health and Wellbeing. Maria's research brings together mental health and education to improve our understanding of how they interact in children and youth. Education is one of the primary social determinants of health, and Dr. Rogers' ultimate goal is to help nurture success at school and beyond. And last but certainly not least, we have Sherwyn Solomon, who's joining us as our community member on the panelist. Sherwyn has been committed to working towards equity in education for over 30 years. His past work in the field has included numerous public speaking engagements and workshops, writing curriculum for the Ontario Ministry of Education, and co-authoring a book. Currently, Sherwyn is the principal at La Fère Elementary School in Ottawa, where he continues his work growing student achievement through his passion for equity and excellence in instructional practice. So maybe we can give them a round of applause for our panelists. So thank you again for joining us tonight. So I'm going to open the conversation tonight with a bit more of a general question about some of the viewpoints that you bring to this issue. And the question is, can you tell us about some of the perspectives and experiences that have informed your work with or on behalf of children and youth in schools? Here, you can actually take this one, Leila.
Okay. Hi, everyone. It's weird to be in person. It's really amazing to see you. And thanks, Carol, and thanks, Julie, for organizing this and for inviting me. So as Julie shared, I'm a sociologist of education. I'm interested in, is it okay? Can you hear? Okay, thanks. I'm interested in the social context of education. And I've been looking at what young people learn from social justice education that actually works contrary to the aims of social justice education. So how schools can be sites for reinscribing racial and colonial hierarchies, actually through the language of solidarity, anti-racism, social justice education. So I'm interested in the genre of the speculative in sociological imagination, which is something that is really really calling to me right now in a pandemic moment. So how the genre of the speculative is a tool, for thinking about haunting, sociological haunting, and kind of the eeriness of the moment that we're in. My work is informed by participatory action research and working directly with young people as co-researchers. I've been a teacher educator as well, which informs my thinking about schools. And I'm also Auntie Lee to 4 nephews between the ages of 6 and 9 as well. And I think a lot about institutional change in my work and theories of change and what is it all for? And part of that comes from being a director of equity and diversity at a school in southwestern Ontario as well. So I think I'll stop there because I think we'll just, keep moving.
All right. Well, yeah, I think
thank you. It's great. I love hearing different people's jobs and the different things that people research and do with their time, and I'm looking forward to this panel very much. My name is Maria, and as Julie mentioned, I am a professor in the psychology department at Carleton University. And I'm a Canada Research Chair. So in my job at Carleton, much of my time is spent in doing research on child and youth mental health. And the main areas that I'm interested in looking at within that field of research is the school experiences of our more vulnerable citizens. So I have a particular interest in children with who are neurodiverse, for example, those with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I have an interest as well in chronic absenteeism. It's a newer area of research for me, and one that has really become really in the spotlight since the pandemic. And as well, I'm starting to do a little bit of work on the well-being and experiences of Indigenous students in our schools. In addition to being a professor, I'm also a registered clinical psychologist with the College of Psychologists of Ontario. And I work with children, adolescents, and families. I do have a small private practice. And in addition to that, I'm also an Indigenous person myself. I'm a member of the Nunatukeavut community of Southern Labrador. And in part because of that, some of my clinical work, I would say most of my clinical work right now is with Indigenous children and youth, both in Ottawa and as well, I work on some reserves in Western Quebec. I'm also a mom. I have 2 boys, Max and Isaac, who are 11 and 16. And so all of those roles kind of put together, I certainly do think it is time to rethink education. And I think this is probably a pretty good time to do it. So I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. I am, I think we were having a little conversation earlier about just how intimidating elementary or teachers in general can be. And of course, I find, professors and universities and higher education, boy, it's super intimidating, right? I am not a doctor. I feel like I should say Fermilon after that, for those of you who know. Some got that. That's good. My name is Sherwyn Solomon. I am a principal, and I have been in education for a very, very long time. And I say in education and not necessarily a principal for a long time. I started in 1989, back when you could teach as a supply teacher when you were still a high school student. So I was in high school at the time, and I was teaching the grade 9s and 10s when there was a teacher absence. And I hated school, and I hated education, and that wasn't my thing. And in fact, I was a university dropout at one point in time as well. That led me to a tremendous experience that I had, which I think informs a lot of what I do as an educator. I'm a bird biologist by training, which is odd. Owls, eagles, hawks, and falcons are my area of specialty. And I was really fortunate to work for the U.S. government at one point in time, researching burrowing owls in Southern California. And at one point in time, there was a group of students from Los Angeles who hadn't really had an opportunity to get out into the field and do the field work that, of course, I was doing on a daily basis, nor had they had the opportunity to really just get out of the city. And during that day I had with them, it changed me. And we often talk in education, the role is either as professors or teachers or ECEs or wherever we work in the system. There's that aha, right? And you see it and you feel it, and that really hit me then. And I knew that what I needed to do was to be in education and to work to give opportunities to students, to youth. And that experience really has informed my work even up to today. I have had the great fortune of serving in, I suppose some would say, some tougher schools. For those from the Ottawa area, I was a principal at Ridgemont High School, York Street School, and I was vice principal at Rideau High School. And then now, of course, I'm at LaFar. And each time in my education journey, I've found that the system does exactly what it was meant to do. And it replicates itself over and over again. And unfortunately, that means that we see with black students, with indigenous students, other students of color, students who are neurodiverse, or don't fit whatever our standard definition is, can struggle in school. And as an educator, I think the thing that comes to my mind is that I wanted wherever I could to disrupt that experience for students, for families, by providing a different lived experience as a black man walking into a school system, but then just give voice to students and families, and how we can, in my perfect world, just dismantle the whole system. That would be wonderful. That's my perspective for now, anyways.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. That was really interesting to hear the different perspectives that you bring. But I hear a lot of commonalities actually among the things that you said. So the first question that is more about the issue of getting back to school is about some of the ways that some of the things that you've learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. So, how has the pandemic shaped your thinking about getting back to school, or about children or young people's relationships with school? Or another way we could say that would be, what lessons, what are the takeaways for you in terms of what you're thinking post/ongoing pandemic regarding children, young people, and schools? And I won't put the spot on Leila to start, so maybe this you won't have to start each time, but anyone want to jump on that? Okay, Maria, thank you.
Julie. Okay, yeah, so when Carol started talking about the panel tonight, and she talked about the disruption, and so that's what comes to mind first for me, is the profound level of disruption that our children and youth have experienced. Well, that we've all experienced, but, especially our children and youth. And this largely comes from the school closures, in part, right? So just to give you some context, the United Nations has concluded that 90% of the world's children and youth have experienced school closures. So that's 1.6 billion children around the world. And here in Ontario, we had the, I guess, fortune or misfortune, depends on how you think about it, of having the most weeks missed in, I believe it is North America, at 20 or 21 weeks of school missed in our public schools. And the research on this is coming out, and it's coming out fast and furious. And some colleagues of ours at the Ontario Institute for Studies and Education, so a research team there, basically have concluded from the research that online learning during COVID was an ineffective and inefficient approach to teaching and learning. Now, as a mom, as a teacher, many of us, don't need necessarily the research studies to show us that. But I think that, I guess when I think about, Julie, your question around sort of lessons learned, I can't help but look at the research. I look to the data, right? And so the effects of the school closures have had direct impacts on our kids and youth, and the research is quite unequivocal right now on that. In terms of their learning, although I tend to think of this as probably the least of our concern, kids are behind in their learning, but in terms of the grand scheme of things, I think that's maybe not as much of a concern, but it is certainly one of the impacts. Children's mental health has suffered. So I don't know if you all remember, but when the pandemic first started, there was some news coverage about how, look how great it is. Emergency room visits for mental health are down, dramatically, all over the world. And people were like, look, the kids are fine, emergency room, everybody's at home being happy. Well, if you actually think about it, why weren't people going to hospitals for mental health? Everybody was terrified, right? This was different than where we are now with our 3 or 4 vaccines, right? This was a different time. The research that kind of continued from there, so there's now been quite a number of studies on the effects of the pandemic on children's mental health and well-being. And in fact, there's been enough studies now that researchers have been able to do what are referred to as meta-analyses. So that's essentially, for those of you who don't know, that's essentially when there's been enough studies on a topic and we can put them all together and statistically synthesize them to look at effects. So instead of looking at a study on 100 people here and a study on 50 people here, we can put research studies together, and a number of meta-analyses have now been concluded that, in fact, the mental health impacts have been fairly profound across the world for mental health. Another area, I know, Julie, you said this, that I shouldn't be doom and gloom, and I'm sorry, but I'm just stating some of the numbers and some of the facts, because I do think there are some lessons in this. But physical activity is another area that has been really impacted. So kids and teens, interestingly, have been much less physically active, and I think a direct implication of that is that much higher rates of screen usage, right, and not necessarily productive screen usage. There is productive screen usage, but we're seeing impacts on physical health and obesity. Okay, so what do I think is sort of the lesson? Where can we go from that in terms of sort of a lesson learned? Well, from my perspective, you know, people often talk about children as being resilient, right? It kind of drives me crazy because I hear this all the time. My mom says it all the time. Oh, the kids will be fine. The kids are, you know, if my kids are struggling, they're like, they're fine, they're good. And actually, children are not inherently resilient. Actually, in fact, it's quite the opposite. So kids, there is no greater time of vulnerability in the human lifespan in terms of the developing brain than childhood, especially early childhood, in terms of the direct effects of adversity and trauma on the developing brain. So if we look at the resiliency literature, what helps children become more resilient is relationships, right? So I feel like one of the core lessons learned, to answer your question, Julie, is that we need to be thinking about the centrality of relationships in our education system. So we know that children thrive in the context, in all areas of their development. If you take a child and isolate them from other humans, they will simply not develop. Children thrive in the context of relationships with others. And learning only, in my opinion, only occurs within the context of a relationship. So when we took that away from our kids, and yes, some relationships can be maintained on a screen, but many kids, especially our more vulnerable kids, were not able to participate in online learning in the same way that other children were. And so they missed out on those important relationships with teachers and with peers. And so moving forward, I guess that's one of my main lessons learned, is that we need to be thinking about relationships in the context of our school system.
Thank you. Who would like to tackle that question next? Sherwyn?
Okay. Thank you. That was I'm learning a lot. I feel like I'm back in school, which is good. That's where I work, so I should feel good about learning. But I will say that maybe this is the pessimist in me. I'm not convinced that we actually, certainly from a school system point of view, I'm not convinced that we actually learned any of the lessons that the pandemic had to offer. I'm hopeful that eventually we will, but nothing in the past has actually, from my worldview as a principal in a school, we haven't done it in the past, and I'm not convinced we're there yet. And I'm speaking really towards equity of access and equity of outcome for students. And one of the things that really hit home, something that we already knew going into school closures and sort of the response with online learning to the school closures, we knew that there was a tremendous gap in access to technology for students. I've known for over a decade, we've known that there are many students who leave our building do not have access to Wi-Fi. And when the government made the move, this is where I get fired, government made the move to synchronous online learning, it negates the fact that in many, many, many homes, even in more affluent neighborhoods and more affluent households, there are not enough pieces of technology or computers to support the learning. So while synchronous learning, it's great, there's a teacher in front of a child ostensibly to deliver a lesson of content between, if it's 8:30 and 3 or whatever the school hours are. The demand, the technological demand, the bandwidth demand of synchronous learning meant that only those students who were affluent enough and families who were affluent enough to either increase the bandwidth from their service provider, pick up an extra piece of technology from their service provider, or from a store or whatever, were able to actually engage in the learning. Students who were coming from homes with low socioeconomic backgrounds were not able to engage in that. Of course, the argument from the minister was that monies were given to families to support that learning. So there were checks, I believe it went out 2, if not 3 times, $200 to $400 to families to support that. With the pandemic, of course, many, many, many families lost employment. And that $200 did not end up with a Chromebook. That ended up with a meal or what was necessary to sustain that family. From a principal point of view, from my point of view, the lesson that we should have learned, because we had known already, was to say, let's get involved. If every, I'm trying to remember the number of students in Ontario school system. I'm going to get it wrong, but I believe it might be about 2 million. It could be more than that. If we had a purchase, a large-scale purchase, that $200 alone would have covered a device, Chromebook, whatever it is, an iPad, for every single student in Ontario. And we would leave the pandemic with students able to engage. So here we are now at the tail end of the pandemic, and we do not, my students who walked in that pandemic with that technology gap still have it. The only difference is now that it is a far more online world. Field trip forms go home electronically. The ability to engage in breakfast programs, permission forms are electronic. So what was a gap before has become a chasm now. And sadly, we know it. And that's where I feel that there ought to have been some lessons learned in terms of equitable access in schools that we still need to learn. It's a difficult argument and a difficult push in schools, because oftentimes we see that the students who are most impacted by the decisions of our bureaucracy, myself included, I am a principal, those families are not the ones who are at our school council or parent council meetings, so they don't get the voice. They're not the ones who are picking up the phone and speaking to the member of parliament, the MPP, to engage in that conversation. They are, many times, they're the service worker who is attempting to make ends meet and is struggling to do so with a school system that has grown more and more distant. One of the other challenges that we certainly encountered was, and I think it's fair to say, although I'm as old as dirt when I walk into a university, I realize that more and more. In my lifetime, there has never been a larger public health emergency globally. There's never been a need to communicate with families in schools on significant decisions. So the ability to access learning either online or at a virtual school, those are decisions that should not be left in the hands of 10-year-olds. We wouldn't do it in any other avenue. What organizations, school boards, mine included, we sent home all of our communication in English. We're an English-speaking board, is our argument. Our clients are not, right? And the challenge with that is that the individuals who are left to do the interpretation or the translation of our university, college level English documents are, in my school, it goes from K to 5, at best 10 or 11 years old. And there is not a person here who would ever allow a major decision about the most significant health issue that we have seen in our lifetimes in the hands of an 11-year-old. And that's precisely what our institutions did. That's precisely what it looked like when OPH, Ottawa Public Health, with their initial sets of communications about who was, if there was a positive case, those communications went home in English or French, which is good. If you are Arabic speaking, if you were Somali speaking, if you spoke Urdu or Farsi, you did not get that communication in a language that you could understand. And so those families continue to either A, send their children to school, because that's what we've asked them to do for years on end, or realize something was wrong and then not return their children to school because they didn't realize that the challenge or the problem had no longer existed. There were lessons to be learned that ought to have been learned, but I will tell you now that they haven't been. And so my plea to you, when you receive communication about things that are of extraordinary importance to you, ask out loud and wonder why. Does this go home in other languages? Especially because, as we had heard in our reporting from OPH, the most significantly impacted communities were not our English-speaking communities. They were our newcomer communities. They were our communities who had multi-generational households and we knew did not speak English. And still, that was our communication. So that was I would say my lesson learned from that was that the system continues to do what it was designed to do. I've never been in doubt about it, but that sort of just, that was my lesson. My hope is to continue to disrupt and see if we can build a different system.
Thank you, Sherwyn. Leila?
Thank you. I'm learning a lot as well, so this is great to be here with you. I'm going to go in a little bit of a different direction, thinking about institutional life and the conditions of doing research, and what is in flux and moving right now, and what isn't moving. So I'm really on board with Sherwyn's observation that we haven't learned lessons that have been presenting for some time, and it's also difficult to distill lessons when we're still in this, right? So one thing that I've been thinking about as being in movement is the timelines and temporal exigencies of institutional life, including of teaching and research. They're actually more fluid than we've been made to believe. So we've seen institutional time, demands on our time, understandings of the relationship between learning and time, bend and warp in the new time signature of the ongoing pandemic. At the same time, what Dion Brand calls the calculus of living and dying, that remains the same. That is the piece that is stuck. So whose bodies are ultimately expendable, that piece is only amplifying, and that's a piece that I'm concerned about going into this school year in the context of growing poverty, right, and for young people, and the hunger that young people are facing in the community. So the precarity is only growing in terms of immigrant, allophone, queer and trans, disabled, Black, Indigenous, racialized communities. So, at the same time that this work is urgent, this research that we're talking about is urgent, it also takes on a new level of exhaustion. As a racialized researcher of race and anti-racism, it is incredibly hard to witness the things that we're witnessing right now. So, schooling has changed. It won't ever look the same, and that's, I think, something to look forward to, as Sherwyn has said. And researching schools is also changing, and won't ever look the same. And I think we're still coming to understand what exactly that will mean. I mean, for me, it's it's in trying to partner with community organizations. People are tired. People are tapped out. It's very difficult to reach young people in that way right now. I mean, I would say that one thing that I feel is shifting right now, a lesson that can be learned, and maybe I was going to speak to this at a later question, but I'll put a little bit here, is just the idea of a learning gap. There's so much there to push the ways in which we understand the context of a learner. And I think, you know, we've had to foreground the context of young people a lot more. I mean, that piece has been put forward in the context of the pandemic, but there's just so much more work to do to understand the social context of students, and to think of a learning gap not, you know, in the kind of developmental narratives that we do, but rather as a structural gap, right? In terms of calcified learning outcomes, pedagogical curricular approaches that are slow to move, slow to change. The ministry curriculum is policy, it's slow to move. And so, yeah, so I guess the last piece I wanted to say that is something emerging, that is something maybe a hopeful piece, or maybe something that we can continue to unfold in the ongoing pandemic moment, is the gentleness that can come out of having to really listen to the learner in front of you and really understand their context and really bring a gentleness to what it is that you both are experiencing in that moment. So of not driving towards the timelines of classrooms, of performance measures, right? But rather sitting, listening, inviting more spaciousness to feel where things want to go, where students are at that day, right? And what really serves students in that moment. So, yeah. So just some thoughts from me on what's moving right now and what's really stuck.
Thank you, Leila. Thank you to all three of you. I think that you've really highlighted some of the really challenging aspects that have been brought to our attention. You know, aspects of schooling, equity, access, the impact of schooling, the lack of relationships that support students, and then some of the structural elements that we're seeing, you know, some that are changing and some that are not changing. So I think you've all done a really good job of kind of providing us with some different perspectives on what we're coming out of the pandemic, so to speak, with, you know, our eyes on these things. But I'm also wondering if you can, it's sort of building on this question, but for those of us here in the audience, you know, those of us who are parents, or those of us who are working with children, I'm thinking more specifically about what challenges they will be facing, what will be facing them as they sit in those desks, as they walk into those schools in this moment of returning to this sense of this urgency for something normal, which I think is also glossing over a lot of the issues that you've raised about some of the things that have been drawn to our attention. We're rushing into this sense of normalcy. So, you know, I guess maybe I'm asking for, you know, sort of a concrete thought about what the children and the young people are facing in terms of challenges as they walk back into schools this year. If anyone has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can start. Okay. I mean, I find I'm stuck a little bit with some of the things that Sherwyn said around, are we really learning the lessons? You know, and that concerns me, because I think those of us who think a lot about education and child health and so on, I think that your comment about rushing back to normal, you know, getting back to normal, and I've said it, right? You know, we want to get back to normal, but is there a way we can rethink things and learn from this? And I feel a little stuck in that regard. I was actually on my driving my kids home from school this afternoon, and I was talking to my youngest son, Isaac, and I was telling him about this. I wanted to pick his brain a little bit. Like, how can we make schools better? Like, you know, like, you're back. You're like, he's so happy to be back and with his friends, and there's no more squares in the schoolyard that they're not allowed out of, and, you know. I was telling him about some of the research on physical activity, right? And he's like, so you're going to tell them to make us have more gym? As like he thought that I would come here tonight and be like, this is the research. So everybody, the kids need more physical activity, right? More gym. Take note. And I thought, you know, just through the mind of a child, right? That it's sort of like that straightforward. Here's this new knowledge that we have, so let's fix the problem. And it's not, I guess, it's that easy to fix those problems. But we are learning from this. And so where can we go from this? One thing that I want to kind of comment on, Julie, before I get to that sort of thinking about, you know, what are kids going to be, what are they experiencing right now, is that we need to think a lot about the kids who are not in our schools right now. So chronic absenteeism was a huge issue of educational inequity before the pandemic. And it has been exacerbated for many of the reasons that you describe through the course of the pandemic. And again, I'll tell you a little bit of some data. When children miss, well, I don't need to tell you, when children miss school, they're missing out, of course, on their learning opportunities, right? So they're much more likely to underachieve academically. But we also know things that, like, relationships with peers suffer. They're more likely, again, I'm not saying one causes the other. I'm not saying that absenteeism causes, you know, mental health problems. They go hand in hand, right? But certainly more likely to experience adversity in terms of mental health. And the longitudinal research on school attendance is remarkable in that if the amount of school that children miss as early as kindergarten is highly predictive of early school termination, so dropping out of high school. So there's a very consistent snowball effect that happens. And this is all data from before the pandemic. And what we are seeing now, although this data is actually very hard to gather, schools are not super willing to school systems, school institutions are not very willing to share this data, but the data around the world is showing that more children are missing school now than like ever before in, you know, recent history. What happened was that for all the reasons we talked about earlier, children disengaged during the pandemic, and they've not yet been re-engaged. Okay, so if I think about sort of my own privileged children who, have food in their tummy, have a drive to school, have all of the sort of things that can help them get to school, there are many children who do not have those privileges, and they are simply, or those that were in solely online school throughout the pandemic, or those that were homeschooled, or those that have simply been forgotten. Like, there are many children in our country that have simply been forgotten, and we don't know where they are. They're not in school, and we don't know where they are. We need to be very concerned about that. What are children facing right now in schools? I think in many ways they're facing many of the same things that they faced before. It's as a clinical psychologist, it's always around end of September, early October that the referrals start coming in. It's when kids are starting to, the honeymoon period of the new school year is over, and we're starting to see some of the common problems that have been there, but at a much higher level. We have a mental health crisis, and certainly nowhere near the amount of services available. So I think that in many ways kids are facing many of the same things, but I find myself being more concerned about the kids who we're not seeing in schools. So I guess I just wanted to comment on that.
Sherwyn or Leila wants to.
I can go. It is difficult to follow, Maria. I ditto, right? On the ground, I see with my eyes the pandemic restrictions, which of course were necessary for so many, and including sit here. I'm 9 days and 11 hours in. I had recently had a cold, and I got 10 days to get this thing off again. But it really normalized school absence in a way that had never been done before. And that, to sort of piggyback a bit, to say that has been a real challenge. It used to be, if a student were to miss 4 days, heck, even 2 days, like you'd be getting a phone call certainly from the school teacher at the minimum. 3 consecutive days absence, that's a significant number of days. It became routine for students to be missing 10 or more days consecutively, multiple times during the school year. And even as we claw that back and say, okay, you can come to school, the mindset has indeed changed. The response there's a thought, and not a fault for any of the parents or the adults who think, that's okay, they'll just go online. But we know that didn't work. Like, it really was awful. And I'm going to editorialize for a second. As a parent who has a master's degree in education, it was horrible. Teaching my own children online, I was a math teacher. You think I could teach my child? No. No. It was awful for many, many, many kids. And that is in my home where, I'm the dumb one in my household with the master's degree. My spouse, is there, highly educated parents. Like, everybody in the house has a piece of technology, and it was still difficult. So when I think about some of the challenges, that is certainly one, that ongoing normalization of school absenteeism has become a real challenge. And in part, unfortunately, another part that came out of the pandemic, we used to have a lot more controls, I would say, as parents, around screen time. And that has gone out the window. And so it's not unusual to see students reporting 10, 11, 12 or higher hours of screen time a day. And it has just become normalized, right? It is just what we do. And it's often unsupervised. So it's a challenge for the parent. It's certainly a challenge for the student to make sure that they're engaging in learning, in-person learning. There's a lot more that goes into in-person learning than the academic content. If anything, and I certainly agree in an appreciation of what teachers and educators do. It used to be, the old adage, if you can't do, you teach. And if you can't teach, you become a principal. I think that's how that goes. It worked, it made sense. But really and truly, there is a fine art to holding the attention of a student and bringing content to life and that teaching and learning process. There's a real art form to it, and I really walked away at the last few years thinking it is so crucial for that kind of engagement to happen for many, many students. That's not happening, and we're hoping to get into a more regular year. I would dare say, in the saying, a more regular year, that is perhaps one of the biggest challenges that I see to schools. Not for the whole. In fact, schools as a whole, we do fairly well, right? So if you look at the data in Ontario, graduation rates are around 89%, right? But when we start to disaggregate, we recognize that that's actually those numbers are highly racialized. If we start to disaggregate that data, the numbers can drop down into the 60s, numbers that we hadn't seen in this province since I believe it was 2004, 2005, around there, when we came up with a plan to, I sort of cringe when I think it was, learning for all, but then it had a metric that said 80% of students will. And I thought, that's certainly not all, that's 20% missing. when we return back to normal, it's normal for whom? Again, I go back to the things I've said each time I've had this microphone, is that school systems, make no doubt about it, explicitly stated, school systems were not designed for everybody. That is not our design. If you read the Education Act, it states clearly in the Ontario Education Act that my job as principal, one of my jobs as principal, is to inculcate by precept Judeo-Christian morality. That is in the Education Act. You can think what you want to think about it, but know that it is there, and it is explicit, right? And it's always been that way. If we return to normal, school systems will simply continue to replicate what we always have done. I'm happy to see some normal return to schools, but I'm aware that if this is a golden opportunity in schools, in society as a whole, to reconstruct our society so that our outcomes serve everybody. It is an opportunity to really push and press school leaders like myself and others, of course, school superintendents, school directors, our elected officials, to do something different than what we have done in the past, 100+ years in school systems in Ontario. Every time you think about, great, we have the return of extracurricular activities, know that explicitly extracurricular activities were designed to keep children away from their immigrant parents. That's what they're for. That's what they've always been for. That's what bells in schools and mandatory school attendance were for. It was to separate Italian families, Irish families, Polish families, Ukrainian families from their children so that they could be in school longer. Because that's where we would normalize them. And of course, the ultimate expression of that is in the residential school system, the fixing a generation. It's not accident, it's on purpose. And when we continue to look at schools as being benign places of learning, it is to turn a blind eye and to ignore the real purpose of schools. And I say this, right? I am, again, it's not lost to me, I'm a black dude as a school principal. I get that, yeah. I am, but I want you to know that I'm an anomaly, right? Like, I escaped. Every system has its flaw, and I would be it, right? My outcomes are not typical for people with my background. That's not, it's a mistake. It's not the design. And so we need, I take this opportunity, I take every opportunity I can to make sure that we understand that until we build a school system that meets the needs of First Nations students, of Inuit students, of Métis students, of black students, of other students, neurodiverse students, until we make a school system that's designed explicitly with that in mind, we will always continue to replicate, and we'll always be wondering, I don't understand why there's this learning gap or this outcome gap, achievement gap. And it's quite clear, like, again, I'm in it. I'm in it every day. I know why it's there. The question is, what are we going to do about it? So I think if there is a challenge that I see in education is taking this moment, and I hope there will never be another moment quite like this in our lifetime, to actually really cast a strong gaze, listen to the research that's out there about what schools do and what we could do differently and better to make it more equitable outcomes for all students, right? That's the real goal, and we need to be forceful about that. One last thing, I'll just simply say this. How many of you have a phone on you, right? Or, I'm super old, so I actually have a landline. When phone systems, when they go down, we measure that. It's like, oh, you remember that day when Rogers was down? right? Like the whole world, all of Canada's like, how does that happen? That's a thing? Come on now, right? The CEOs of the big telecoms are all called together because the system was down for one day. It was a hard day, I'll be honest, right? But it was one day. So the success rate for a phone or for a car, right, is truly it's like 99%, right? 99.9% of the time, it functions exactly as we would want it to. Schools proudly tout 10% of our students fail. That's not okay. How is that possible? You mean they join you from age 3 and they leave at 17 and 10% of them don't make it? That's craziness. That's not okay. Now, we actually say it's a 90% graduation rate and we feel really good about it. But that means 10% of the kids who we see fail. If you picked up your phone and 1 out of every 10 times it didn't work, you would get a new phone. If you walked in your garage or out your driveway or wherever to get in your vehicle or to hop on the bus, now I really can't talk about the LRT because maybe 1 in 10, they might be happy for that one. But that system aside, if that had happened in any other system, we would be up in arms. It's not okay. And again, I'm a school principal. I'm telling you, 10% of students not being successful at the end of over a decade of presence in my presence is not an acceptable number. It should be 99% or higher, 100% of kids. Our challenge is to take a look at our status quo and say it's not acceptable that 10% of our kids don't, after spending all that time with us, don't make it through. It's not okay. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Leila, you're going to follow that up?
Give it a try. Give it a whirl. Building on what Sherwyn shared, I'm really with Black abolitionists, feminists in this moment who are calling for the abolition of schooling, right? This is a moment where that can be brought to the table, right? That we find that suddenly resources are made available that people have been asking for years. They suddenly become available when the right people are impacted, right? That we can think about things, we can think about possibilities in schooling that just weren't possible a few years before. I just had to agree with that point that there are people dwelling in the institutional cracks, right, who have other tools, who have community-based tools. If we want to think about youth participatory action research, it's not a perfect tool. It's another way, though, that we can challenge the structure, think about how schooling might look different, right? So people are around. We don't need more data to know that schooling in Ontario is anti-Black, that is anti-Indigenous, that is a white settler colonial institution. We know that, right? But we also have people, with the knowledge to create some of these other spaces. So, I think it's exciting to think about administrators who have access to resources, who can steal resources, right? To bring some of these conversations to the forefront, right? I think that the idea of disengagement, right, and absenteeism is one that's been really heartily critiqued, right, in critical youth studies and elsewhere, that is a statement of resistance, of refusal. And so it's incumbent on educators to really to hear that and to understand that for what it is, and that it's not a failure, and it's not an inability, it's not a lack of resilience, right? It is a clear statement that they are not putting their body in that room, right? So these are some of the possibilities. I think just one of the challenges that I just wanted to mention again is just the numbers coming out on poverty and hunger in the context of just ballooning inflation in Ontario. So some of the things that, could be shocking, but, leave that to see. But Breakfast Club of Canada feeds more than 580,000 across the country, is facing a $2 million shortfall. I mean, the Education Foundation Ottawa is an independent charitable arm of the Ottawa Carleton District School Board, is reporting that 1 in 5 children in their schools are living in poverty. This is only a problem that's compounding in the coming year. But again, there are. I think Canada is the only G7 country without a federal food program in schools. There are models out there. There are tools out there if the willingness is there, right? I think I'll leave it there for now. We can go to the next thing.
Well, and I think I'm going to open it up to our audience questions here in a moment, but I just want to kind of reflect on some of the challenges, challenges and possibilities. I think I heard, in some of the things that you all said, and when coming into this panel, one of my thoughts was, well, it may be doom and gloom. It may be a bit depressing to talk about back to school in less of an exciting way, because I know that, as like I think you mentioned, Maria, how excited your son was to be back. And I know that a lot of us have felt that, certainly I felt the energy of being back in person and, seeing people again, and that's exciting. So I think that that's certainly one of the possibilities, and one of the good things, is that there is some excitement around getting back to some things that are familiar to us. But I hear your concern, Sherwyn, and I think that this was echoed, this idea of like rising to the challenge of this moment and actually choosing to act on, I think Sherwyn described it as a golden opportunity to do something different. And I think I certainly relate to that in terms of, thinking about, for myself, my own work has focused a lot on, for the last couple of years, thinking about the construct of childhood innocence, what is problematic about always seeing childhood as a time of magic and bliss, and that's its sort of natural state, which really prevents us from processing and understanding children's trauma. And I think that one of the things that's come out of the pandemic is that, like, we have at least to some extent realized that, being a child or being a young person is hard. It's not easy work, to live through a pandemic. It wasn't easy for us as adults. It wasn't easy for children either. And perhaps even more difficult for them because they have they're more marginalized in the sense that they have less autonomy and less control over what happens in their lives. So I think that, in a sense, one possibility is that we have at least opened our eyes, or at least some of us have opened our eyes to these challenges and to these things that have come about. But I think it's really, I think as Leila said, it's incumbent upon educators and also those of us who are advocating for these perspectives and bringing this work to light, to keep pushing against this urgent return to normalcy, and to think about how we might be able to work against that sense of let's just get back to it. Because I think that applies also in terms of thinking about, childhood as being, this magical time of bliss and happiness. Of course, we want our children to feel happy, but I think our push to just forget about what has happened for the last 2.5 years is certainly only going to do them a disservice in terms of really listening to their experiences and learning from what they have experienced in this time. So I just want to thank you again for all of your very insightful responses, and I want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. We have about 20 minutes left, so thank you. So I'll just turn it over to the audience. If you have questions, Carol, do you want to bring the microphone around? Okay, all right, I'll give this up, and just if you'd like to raise your hand, Carol will bring the microphone around to you.
Pat, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, if that's okay. There we go. Great. Hi, everyone. So my name is Patrizia Gentile. I'm a prof as well at Carleton. And I'd like to thank you all for your amazing insights and thoughts. And I wanted to ask you a question about protest, because we were talking about, I agree, let's abolish. But abolishing in revolution means there's things that might happen, like no more teachers, right? Which is great too, at least in the way, the manifestation as we have them now. But I actually do want to talk about protest. So I think before I came here, I was listening to the news, and I think it's in Northern Virginia. It doesn't really matter, Virginia, somewhere in Virginia. The high school students have walked out of classes because the governor of Virginia has declared basically a cultural war and an attack on trans children and youth. And so here we have, another way of seeing how this world, this moment in time, this historical moment where schools, which have always been these political platforms, are now the sites of major cultural wars. And in the Canadian context, around residential schools, whether we should teach about residential schools to young children or not. In the States, again, around critical race theory, so-called, they don't know what critical race theory is. Anyways, but this idea that they're not going to talk about slavery or teach about slavery, right? But we're having, these young children and young people who are protesting. So what part of my question is, I'd like to get your thoughts on that particular, right? If the adults are not going to do anything, looks like they're going to do something about it. So I'd like your thoughts about that. And the other part I'd like is another way of thinking, how is this protest, how is this onus to actually get something done being put on the shoulders? I can't say it. Of young children. What is the consequence, if there are any, or maybe a potentiality in terms of mental health or thinking through about futurity and futures and new futures or new ways of knowing, a new world? I mean, is that protest a place? So I'd like to hear from the principal, how does the bureaucracy administration kind of deal with or think through these protests in these contexts, mental health and protest, and questions of social justice, because protests are about social justice. So I'm interested in your research and how you're going to deal or think about those kinds of situations. Thank you very much.
I'll tell you, my students are K to 5, but I don't know that negates them from the ability to protest or to we use edubabble, which is what educators like to use to make themselves sound smarter. So we sometimes we call it student voice. And there is absolutely a place, and I'll tell you a bit of, the hardest thing for an educator to do is to put down the mic, get off the stage, and sit in the audience with the student. And a lot of that is allowing, let me rephrase that. As soon as I introduce a system of control. And again, I'm a principal. That's what I do. Protest necessarily is in defiance of status quo. It has to be. I think where I, as an educator, as a principal, what I encourage my staff to do, what I encourage my students to do, and my parents to do, is to lob tomatoes at my school. Not figuratively, because I don't want to clean it up, but sorry, not literally, figuratively, because I don't want to clean it up. Is to really, everything that I do, we speak about decolonization, and I'm not always sure I understand exactly what I mean when I say that, I'll be honest. But I normally have my name tag here. The fact that my name tag says Mr. Solomon is colonial in and of itself. So I've changed it. It now says Sherwyn Solomon. And I give kids a choice to call me Sherwyn. Because to be perfectly honest, my authority doesn't rest in the Mr. Right? Yeah, that's not where that exists. We'd spoken a bit about relationships with students. To be in a relationship, to be in an authentic relationship means to be okay with conflict. it just has to be there. And I think John Hattie, we had talked earlier, Maria had mentioned some meta-analyses. There is strong educational research that speaks to one of the most powerful interventions that as an educator we can do is a student-teacher relationship, by far. Homework, nothing. Student-teacher relationship. Extra work, literacy programming, all those things. Student-teacher relationship is by far, and not when I say by, like not a little bit, by far a much more effective way to raise academic achievement. And the hardest part about that, I would say, is not the kids, it's the adults. So protest, as I look at it as a principal, a school leader, I invite dissent on my staff. I always tell them, I never have the right answer. As principal, I may have the last answer, but it is not the right answer. It is always a point of argument and discussion. And if we continue to have those spaces where students we teach them to defer their understanding of the world to us. We teach them, and you know this when you come across the 2-year-old who's walking around with the shoes off and their hands half down. They've defined the world as they know it. They go through school and we teach them normal, right? We teach them. We take them in from idiosyncratic.
Or conformity. Or this question
Conformity,
of conformity.
yeah, it's idiosyncratic into nomothetic, right? So the idea is that we need to just listen as adults. Those protests, that's youth voice. That is what they're saying. It is just time for us to listen, and that would mean, honestly, from my point of view, when I hear that, I actually have to hear that and say, I have nothing to say when youth have something to speak to me. They just need to be able to say it. And then my job, I hope my job as a principal is to act upon what youth have said they need to the best of my ability, and then go back to them and say, did I get that right? I got to put my shoes back on. It feels weird.
Gosh, Pat, that's a big question.
Right?
Right?
I
I mean, on the one hand, I'm thinking, how can adults show up for these young people? Are you scheduling a test on that day? Are you putting snacks for them outside? Are you how can you support? If, on the one hand, maybe people need to get out of the way. Maybe that's the support. But also, I think one thing that's pedagogical about that moment for young people is who shows up for me now? We're putting ourselves on the line. Who's there for us, right? And I think that is a real learning moment. So I think the more administrators can support that kind of work, I think that's powerful. The more teachers can do that on their own, adults can do that on their own. I think that's incredibly, incredibly powerful, and that builds a kind of relationship of care around an intergenerational way of thinking about engaging in change, right? And it's hard, right? Because you don't want that onus to be on young people, and yet there is just so much that needs to be heard from young people as well. But I think that onus, part of what I'm suggesting to address that is just how we show up for young people in here and offer support and offer a real intergenerational kind of what we can bring to support what they're doing. So I forgot the other thing. So.
Well, and just to follow up on that, I'm hopeful actually about that particular piece. I'm hopeful about that. I think many adults, caregivers, teachers, principals are showing up for kids in these situations. I can think of an example just this past year when there was a pretty significant protest at my son's high school around an anti-trans protester and there was a counter protest. And man, did the parents and the teachers show up for those kids. It was a beautiful thing, actually. So I feel hopeful in that regard. But yeah, it is a big question, isn't it? And just to follow up on again, I know I said earlier about, what I believe as the importance of relationships, and coming back to just to follow up on a point around teacher-student relationships. And I often ask people to think back to their favorite teacher. And what was it about that teacher, right? And it wasn't that they had their master's in education or that they, it was because they showed you in some way that they cared for you, right? That you were, it was an authentic relationship, that you were a real person in their eyes. They listened to the voice. And I know as a parent for myself, when I get that call on August 31st or whatever that says, your child has been assigned this teacher for the year, I'm not thinking about whether that's a good teacher in terms of instruction, in terms of their educational qualifications. I'm thinking about, is my kid going to have a good year? Is this teacher going to get my kid? Are they going to understand my child? And are they going to care for my child? And so I think that I really feel like that the centrality of the relationship is at the very core, not just of human wellness, but of our entire education system. Anyways, that's not about protest, but I just had to get that.
It's because that relationship is about care work, right?
That's right.
And it's an aspect of schooling that actually takes place in universities as well.
Yes.
It's not just a particular characteristic or could be a particular characteristic about schools at the elementary or secondary school level, right? So.
Well, and just one last point on that, the research that Sherwyn was referring to around the teacher-student relationship being the number one predictor of, of outcomes for children, it's also, that research also unequivocally shows that it is especially strong for children who are at risk, sort of behaviorally or emotionally or academically. And that research has shown clearly beyond the child's IQ and beyond the family socioeconomic status. So that teacher-student relationship is something extremely special. And you know it as a parent when your child gets that great relationship. I mean, it means the world. It's so important.
Can you indulge me with one question? I'm just going to build on the relationship question, because two of the strains I'm hearing very much are a need to change the sort of structures of institutions and the centrality of relationships. So just to push that a little bit further, how do we build these ideas of the importance of relationships into curriculum, into the kind of structure of the way schools are built? How do those two pieces come together?
Well, I would like to hear others' perspectives on this, and I come from the psychology perspective, and not necessarily, I'm not a teacher like my colleagues here by training, but I think about when we're talking about relationship, I'm not just talking about the teacher-student relationship, although that's the one that kind of comes to mind. A lot of my research is on parent-teacher relationships and family-school sort of collaborative relationships. Of course, peer relationships, parent-child relationships. It's all kind of at the core of, child development and education. And then the question of how we kind of build that in, I think is also, it's similar to the protest question in that it's a biggie. Like, as someone who studies relationships, that's a really big question, and I don't know what the answer to that is, because it involves so much from both the teacher and as well as the child, right? So the teacher is coming with their own biases, implicit and explicit, with their own history, with their own attachment patterns and so on. So, I guess a starting point is really focusing on it at a level of, at the pre-service level. I know that, I have colleagues in the Faculty of Education at the University of Ottawa who said maybe like one class they talk about the teacher-student relationship. So again, sort of like bringing it into focus at all different levels. From a school perspective, reaching out to families with, in a culturally sensitive, reaching out to the communities within, that our students are living in. And so starting to take some steps. It wasn't that long ago that when kids entered school in Ontario, the kindergarten teacher would go visit the family in the summer. I was talking to one of my colleagues about this as we were sort of thinking, what can we do to make this system better? My colleague said, yeah, my kindergarten teacher came to my backyard when I was 5, and we talked, and we had a little visit, and it was like, it had nothing to do with screening for literacy or anything like that. It was about, hi, I'm your teacher, and, so there's that sort of foundation for the relationship. And I think we've lost, and I think COVID has maybe put us at even greater risk of losing that stuff because, in kindergarten classes, not anymore, but at least as of last year, there were still dividers between everybody's desks, and the teacher had a big plexiglass thing. So there was, even just the mask for many children, inhibits that relationship formation. So, yeah, I don't think I answered your question, Kara. Just some thoughts. Did you want to share?
Jump in with one thing as the Youth Participatory Action Research, one of the Youth Participatory Action Research people on this panel, is that we can start with the pedagogical relationship, right? And decentering, what Sherwyn was talking about, decentering the teacher as expert. Because that is incredibly powerful in terms of changing the teacher-student relationship from one of evaluation, one of judgment. It's so incredibly difficult for teachers to do that, and so incredibly transformational for young people to have that experience where they're being deferred to as somebody who has knowledge, as somebody who is valued, as somebody who is equally human in that relationship. So I think that's one really important entry point for thinking about that.
Hi. I'm so glad I came. Really great to hear what you all had to say. My name is Jennifer Gilbert. I'm from the Center for Initiatives in Education at Carleton. And I have a question that is a little bit of a different direction potentially, but I just wanted to first respond to the things that people have been saying and say, I completely agree about the relationship thing and also learning from kids. Learning from children and youth and young people. And I think in university we need to do that too. I've been teaching at Carleton for 20 years, and everything meaningful I've learned from my students. It's just been me coming to teach them and then them teaching me is what happens every year. And it's changed my life in a good way. And I'm also the mom of a queer and trans teenager and who's neurodivergent and politically active, and I learn a lot from that person as well, and I'm incredibly proud of them. And even though I'm educated and have a lot of social capital, as they were going through the school system, it was a fight. I had to go to battle sometimes, even though, I've got whiteness on my side and all kinds of things on my side, I still had to go to battle. And so I would often think about, the parents that don't have all those things working for them. So anyway, this is a really meaningful discussion. But my question is for the panelists. At the center where I work at Carleton, we are all about access to post-secondary education and programming and initiatives that are going to transform education and in a way that benefits the most marginalized and the most vulnerable. And so what we've been strategizing is trying to come up with initiatives and trying to get things going to reach out to middle school and high school kids, because there's a huge need for assistance, and try to, if possible, get into the schools and help. And so my question is, especially for Sherwyn, but for everybody, is what kind of initiatives and partnerships are needed from a unit at the university that would most help the children who most need it?
Thank you for that. That's a great question. And one of the things I can speak to some of the things and initiatives that I've been involved with in my schools. I was formerly at York Street Elementary School, public school, which was very close to the University of Ottawa campus. Their student residence building was like, I don't know, 50 meters from our school. One of the partnerships we had was very simple, was to have those university students come over and read to our kids. We would have for many kids, understanding that there is another path, or that there are alternatives is the spark, is the start. We live in a city with the University of Ottawa, with Carleton University, with Algonquin College, and there are many, many, many youth and kids who have never set foot on campus, even up to the time they're set to graduate from a high school, from secondary. Getting in there early with whatever it is, and it doesn't really matter. I think making that part of their lived reality is key, whether that be through just coming on campus and having a few years ago, I'm super old, like I said, 15 years ago, there was I can't remember, it was like a Kids Can News or there was a Kids News and Carleton's journalism program. What would happen is kids would make their own news reports, and then they'd bring it in. They would be showcased in one of, I can't remember where on campus, and the journalists and professors would be there, and they would have conversations with kids about that. That's important, not because, frankly, any of these kids were going to go on to be journalists. They may or may not, but because they realized that there was a path. Like, it didn't end at high school. It didn't end at elementary school. Whatever it is that you have to offer, and that could be, coming in to support the Terry Fox Run, going in on Orange Shirt Day and helping that, like getting things that those outreach activities are exactly what we need. Providing things that university students do very well. Just read. If you can read, come on into a school. And now that the pandemic's at the tail end of it, come on in, read to kids, support them in that, take them on a campus and let them have a good time so that they see it as a place that they are expected to go. Last thing I'll talk about is there's this thing that happens annually called the Walk with Excellence. It's targeting Black youth. And so what happens is we walk with our graduates from their high school. It's a symbolic walk, of course. And we could actually walk from York Street, from the elementary school to the high school, then from the high school to the university campus, to show that, A, the community was with you, and B, that there is an expectation that you are moving on to either university or college or the world of work, but that there's community there. And so any of those things, if please do, we can connect and talk about other ways that there are as many schools as there are that many ways to engage.
I just want to really quickly jump in. I mean, I'm just wondering about, because it's such a great question, and I'm really wondering about a partnership with the OCDSB for a credit course, right, that uses, for example, youth participatory action research for students who don't normally see themselves as someone who has a right to these spaces, right, and to have the opportunity to work with university researchers to really see themselves as somebody who's capable of doing that work, and then to gain a credit that would actually facilitate the institutional requirements as well. And then, of course, we have to think about on the institutional side, do we have what the supports in place for these students to be successful and to graduate once they're here, right? So just a very quick reply.
There was another question.
Hello. Sorry, usually around these little talks that I do, I get a bit nervous whenever I get the mic. But first of all, I'd like to say thank you for the whole panel. This is my first ever panel to come to, and I felt super amazed with everything. I came in wanting to ask a lot of questions because it's well. First, let me start. My name is Mahir Moyuddin, or Mahir, if you guys like to say it that way. Former Carleton student, graduated 2 years ago in child studies. And it was like, this topic is very geared towards my university career. So I came in wanting to ask so many questions, but there was a lot of things that already have been answered, such as like when it comes to teacher and peer relationships, as well as when it comes to like learning from students, learning from the youth itself, figuring out how curriculum should be made through them specifically. But I think the one thing that I find interesting, because for me as a person, I always believe that normalcy is a myth. I believe that you can never go back to a normal per se. I always feel like change is always going to happen regardless of what normal used to be. And I feel like the one thing that was connected towards change was this integration of online, this integration of technology through online space and such. And I feel like that institutions as well as the educational system is trying to remove that specifically. Maybe not for like elementary students or such, but maybe for like middle schools and high schools and university students. I always feel like that there's this sense that institutions just want to really quickly get back to that in-person classes and let's get rid of that online stuff because it doesn't work. But it takes away from a lot of people that felt like they feel connected towards the online space itself and feel like they feel more better learning from the online space itself. So I always wondered, is there a way that online or technology can be integrated into our curriculum, into our educational systems, so that way a side of students don't feel isolated for not having that anymore? Because I always felt like that was a step forward, because we're always growing with technology. Technology is constantly growing with us, so why can't we grow with it? That's what I'm asking.
I'll say thank you for that. It's very refreshing for me to hear that point of view, because certainly there are ways for schools to do different. I think where I see some of the gaps for us as educators, certainly in and around training and understanding. And maybe you should get your B.Ed and come work for me. And I'm just saying, if you got, I'm hiring. We don't have. I mean, honestly, when I went to university, I'm super old. God, there was. I mean, Windows was not a thing. So the whole online learning space is learning for me. It's not. I'm not a digital native. I don't have Facebook. I don't have TikTok, and I don't even actually have really cable. So it's not me, and I know that. But what I think we need is, if we are, education systems tend to be developed and designed by people of my age who are almost always 30 years removed from the school, the teaching and learning process. What we need is always fresh young people to come in and say, maybe we do it this way. Let me show you. And so I encourage you to say, yeah. I can't answer what that learning model would look like. I'm far too old to actually be able to do it. And you don't want me perpetuating the status quo. I need somebody like you and others like you to break that status quo, to say, this works for me and this is how. And on your end, you need to find leaders, school leaders, who are able to move away from ownership of a school system as it was, as opposed to what it could be. I don't know if that's helpful.
super fast. I think it's such an important accessibility issue. And just from my perspective, teaching undergraduate students, we've developed so many amazing tools for online teaching and learning that we shouldn't be throwing those away right now. We should be integrating them to move forward, right?
Okay, well, thank you. I think we're just beyond time, but I just want to say thank you again to everyone. I'll pass this over to Carol to close things down, but thank you again to our panelists and to the wonderful audience. And I will just let, Carol, you have a mic, so you don't need my mic, so go ahead.
Okay, I'll just reiterate that. Another round of applause for just this thoughtful panel, had us really thinking. And while you're clapping, I want you to clap for three wonderful people at the back. Kimberly, Alyssa, and Ash. My colleagues, Alyssa and Kimberly, who really made this happen, and Ash for doing all the tech. So thank you, and thank you for the wonderful questions and the engagement. Really, really thoughtful discussion. Thank you.